The Honda Civic made a sound like a man clearing his throat for the last time. Then a rattle. Then nothing at all. Maren Holloway turned the key twice. The dashboard stayed dark. The check engine light, which had been glowing since the spring thaw, finally went out for good. She sat with both hands on the wheel and watched a hawk circle over a cornfield that stretched to the edge of the world. Route 11. September. Nebraska. She had never driven this road before in her life. She was 20 years old. She had $62 folded in the front pocket of her jeans, a duffel bag in the back seat that held everything she owned, and a tin box in the glove compartment that had belonged to her grandmother Adeline. The tin was olive green, dented on one corner, and inside it lay a sewing kit, needles, thread, a thimble worn smooth by 40 years of fingers, a measuring tape stiff with age, and tucked into the lid behind a piece of yellowed wax paper, a photograph of Adeline at 25, standing in front of a brick apartment building somewhere east of here, smiling at a camera held by a man Maren had never known. The tin had survived every shelter, every group home, every back seat she had slept in, since the system let her go at 18. 2 years on the road. 2 years of cleaning jobs paid in cash, of stretching one meal across 2 days of learning that the world has very little patience for a young woman with no address. She locked the car out of habit, even though there was nothing left worth stealing. She lifted the duffel onto her shoulder and tucked the tin under her arm and started walking. The sign said Millbrook 2 miles. The September sun was already falling. The air carried that first thin edge of fall, the kind that warns you winter is coming, whether you are ready for it or not. Maren was not ready. She walked along the shoulder gravel, crunching under her boots, and tried not to think about where she would sleep. Millbrook appeared the way small towns appear out of flat country. A water tower in the distance first, then a church steeple, then the rooftops. Main Street was 4 blocks long. A diner called Rosalie's with a hand-painted sign of a coffee cup, a hardware store, a post office, a barber shop with the chair empty in the window. The smell of fried onions drifted from the diner, and her stomach tightened against her belt. At the end of Main Street, the county courthouse stood square and brick against the dimming sky. Its parking lot was full of pickup trucks and folding chairs and farmers in seed caps. A man in a navy windbreaker stood on a flatbed trailer holding a clipboard and a microphone, his voice carrying down the block. A county surplus auction. Maren had seen these before in other towns. Cities and counties unloading what they no longer wanted. Old equipment. Foreclosed lots. Trucks with bad transmissions. She drifted closer because at least it was somewhere to stand while she figured out her next move. Lots came and went. A 1982 tractor for $300. A shipping container for $80. A pallet of fence posts for $45. Then the auctioneer's voice changed. He smiled at the crowd, and it was the kind of smile that said he already knew the next lot was going to be a joke. Lot 14, he called. Half-acre on the east edge of town. Formerly the site of the municipal water tower. Tower collapsed during the storm of 2016. The lot includes the foundation, all remaining debris, and whatever wildlife has moved in since. He paused. Starting bid $5. Nobody moved. A man in a seed cap laughed. Another shook his head. A woman elbowed her husband. Come on, folks. $5. You spend more than that on coffee. Silence. The auctioneer raised his gavel. Going once, going twice. $5, Maren said. Every head turned. She felt the stares land on her at once. A young woman with dirt on her jeans and a duffel bag at her feet, buying a pile of rubble. The auctioneer blinked. We have 5. Do I hear 10? Nothing. "Sold," he said, and the gavel came down. "Lot 14 to the young lady. See the clerk for paperwork." She did not see the man in the back row of the crowd watching her. She did not notice him at all. A man in his mid-40s, broad in the shoulders, gray at the temples, wearing a dark wool coat that did not belong on a Tuesday afternoon in Millbrook. He stood very still and watched Maren walk to the clerk's table. He watched her sign her name. He watched her tuck the deed into her duffel bag. And when she walked out of the courthouse parking lot, the man pulled a phone from his coat pocket and made a call that lasted less than 30 seconds. The clerk was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain. She took the $5 bill and slid 3 forms across the counter. "Sign here, and here, and here." She paused. "Lot 14, east on Maple past the grain elevator right on Tower Road. You can't miss it." She studied Maren over the glasses. "Well, you can't miss what's left of it." "Thank you," Maren said. The clerk did not let go of the deed right away. She held it a moment longer than she needed to. Her eyes moved over Maren's face, the way a person reads a letter they were not expecting. Then she handed it across the counter. "Good luck, miss." Maren walked east. The sun was almost gone, painting the sky in colors she did not have words for. Copper and rust and the deep blue that comes just before the stars. She passed the grain elevator, turned right onto a dirt road, and followed it a quarter mile until the lot rose out of the prairie like something a giant had thrown down and forgotten. The fence was chain link sagging on its posts, rusted to the color of old blood. The gate hung on one hinge. Inside, half an acre of weeds and gravel. And at the center of it all, the bones of the water tower. The steel framework had come down in pieces. The cylindrical tank itself had split open along an old seam and lay on its side, half buried in dirt and wild grass, like the ribcage of something that had once walked the earth, and now did not. Maren stood at the gate with her hand on the latch. $5. Her name on a deed. Half an acre that no one in Millbrook had wanted for 8 years. She pushed through the gate, and that is when she heard the sound. A low whimper, coming from inside the fallen tank. She froze. She bent slowly and picked up a length of rebar from the rubble at her feet. She held it across her body the way a man might hold a baseball bat, and walked toward the opening in the steel. The last light of the day came in at a long angle through the split in the tank. And in that light, curled against the inner wall, Maren saw a dog. A German shepherd. Thin. The ribs showed through the dirty fur. One front paw was tucked up against the chest, the way an animal favors a limb that has been hurt for a long time. The dog's eyes met hers, dark and steady, and did not look away. "Hey," Maren said softly. "Hey, it's all right." The dog did not growl, did not move, just watched. She lowered the rebar. She set the duffel down. She unzipped the front pocket and pulled out a gas station sandwich wrapped in plastic. Turkey and Swiss on bread gone slightly stale. She had been saving the second half for breakfast. She unwrapped it now and set it on the ground halfway between her boots and the dog. Then she stepped back. The dog waited a full minute before it moved. Then it stood slow and careful, limping on the front paw that favored the left side. It walked forward and ate the sandwich in 3 bites, and looked up at her and waited. "You live here?" she asked. The tail moved. One slow, cautious wag. "Yeah," Maren said. "Me too, I guess." She named him Briggs that first night, because he kept walking the perimeter of the fence, the way a man walks a property line, the way the foreman of an old crew might check on his men before sundown. Briggs. It was a name with weight in it. She set up camp using a tarp from the duffel and 2 chunks of broken concrete as anchors. She found a sheltered place against the remains of a low concrete wall, on the north edge of the foundation, where the wind could not reach her directly. She made a small bed of folded clothes in her jacket. She lay down with her boots still on and watched the sky. She had never seen stars like that. Growing up in the system, she had always been in cities. Fluorescent lights in the hallways of group homes. Street lamps through the windows of shelters. Headlights on her face in the back seats of cars that were not hers. The sky over a city is not a sky. It is a ceiling. This sky was the floor of something larger than she could hold in her chest. Briggs settled about 10 feet from her. He did not come closer, but somewhere in the middle of the night, when the cold dropped down out of the prairie and crept along the ground, she felt him move. He lay against her side, his back pressed to her ribs, and his breathing slowed and hers slowed with his. She slept. The first 3 days were about survival, and survival was something she understood. She found a public restroom behind the courthouse that was unlocked during business hours. She filled water bottles at the sink and washed her face and combed her hair with her fingers in the warped metal mirror. She walked 2 miles down the highway to a gas station and bought a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter and a pack of bologna for less than $7. She rationed it. She drank a lot of water to keep her stomach quiet. And she worked. She did not know why she worked. She had no plan beyond a tarp and a tin box and a dog. But Adeline had taught her that when everything else falls apart, you use your hands. So she dragged steel beams to the fence line. She stacked broken concrete in piles by size. She pulled weeds out of the foundation cracks with the leather palms of work gloves that were too big for her. She bled through them on the second day and kept going. The foundation began to show itself. It was bigger than she had expected. A concrete slab roughly 30 feet across, perfectly round, with a raised rim, where the tower's base had once been anchored. Steel bolts still jutted from the perimeter, rusted to a dark orange. Whoever had built this had built it to last. The collapse had not cracked the foundation. The collapse had only knocked down what stood on top of it. On the 4th morning, a black pickup truck slowed on Tower Road and pulled over at the gate. A woman climbed out, late 60s. Silver hair cut close to the skull. Hands that looked like they had spent a lifetime gripping tools. She wore a canvas apron with deep front pockets and carried a 1-gallon jug of water. "You the one who bought the water tower lot?" she said. It was not a question. "That's me," Maren said. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Doreen Wexler. I own the hardware store on Main." She held the jug out. "Brought you this. You've been out here 4 days with no running water. People notice." Maren took the jug. It was heavier than she expected. "Thank you." Doreen looked over the lot. She took in the sorted rubble, the cleared rim of the foundation, the tarp shelter against the concrete wall. Briggs sitting at Maren's heel alert, watching the older woman with calm interest. "You've done all this by hand. Don't have much else." Doreen was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into the bed of the truck and pulled out a pair of leather work gloves, new. Good ones, the kind that cost $20 at her own store. "Here, your hands are going to be hamburger if you keep going bare." Maren did not move. She had learned a long time ago not to take things from people. Everything came with a price, or it got taken back, or it meant you owed someone, and owing someone was a debt that could be called in at the worst possible moment. Doreen saw it in her face. "They're just gloves," she said. "I've got a whole store full of them. Come by if you need anything else. I'll run you a tab. You can pay it when you can." "I can't pay a tab right now." "I didn't ask you to pay it right now." Doreen climbed back into the truck. The door creaked. Before she pulled away, she leaned out the open window. "That lot has been sitting empty for 8 years. You're the first person to do anything with it. That counts for something." She drove off. A small cloud of dust hung in the road behind her and then settled. Maren put on the gloves. They fit. Over the next 2 weeks, she fell into a rhythm. She woke at dawn. She worked until the heat peaked. She walked to town for water and whatever food she could afford. She worked again until dark. She slept on the ground with Briggs pressed against her side. But something else was happening too. On the 7th day, while she was hauling a piece of bent steel paneling toward the fence, a black Cadillac SUV rolled slowly past on Tower Road. Tinted windows, new tires. It did not stop. It crawled along at 15 miles an hour, and then it kept going, and she watched it until it disappeared around the bend toward the highway. 2 days later, the same SUV passed again. She did not say anything to Doreen. She did not have anyone else to say it to. On the 10th day, she walked into Rosalie's diner for a cup of coffee. Because she had saved up $2 and because the wind that morning had cut through her jacket like wet paper. She sat at the counter and warmed her hands on the mug. The diner was nearly empty. A few old men at a corner booth arguing about a county road project. The cook in the back. And Rosalie herself behind the counter, an Irish woman with a face that had seen 70 hard winters refilling Maren's cup without being asked. Maren heard Rosalie's voice drop to Doreen, who had come in for a sandwich. "That girl out at the tower lot," Rosalie murmured. "She doesn't know." "Doesn't know what?" Doreen said. "Whose ground she's sitting on?" Maren kept her eyes on the coffee. She held very still. "They've been wanting that parcel for years," Rosalie said. "The whole east stretch. Every farmer between the grain elevator and the county line knows it. Somebody at the county slipped up putting it in the surplus auction. And now there's a girl living on it." Doreen said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Let them try." That was all Maren heard. But it was enough. She paid for the coffee and walked back to the lot. And that afternoon, she added a length of barbed wire to the top of the leaning gate, twisted it tight with pliers from Doreen's store, and slept that night with the rebar within reach of her hand. It was Briggs who found the seam. He had been doing it for 2 days, scratching at one particular spot near the center of the slab, where 2 large sections of concrete met. She had told him to stop twice. He kept coming back. On the 17th morning, while she was pulling another twisted piece of steel paneling off the east side of the foundation, she heard him whining low in his throat. She turned. He was digging hard, his front paws throwing dirt and gravel behind him, his ears flat with concentration. "Briggs, hey, what are you doing?" She walked over and crouched beside him. The concrete here was different. She ran her gloved hand along the surface and felt it. A seam, not a crack from the collapse. A deliberate line where 2 sections of concrete had been poured separately, with a thin gap between them, sealed with something dark. Tar, or some kind of old caulking compound that had gone hard with time. She knocked on the concrete with her knuckle. The section on the right sounded solid. She moved her hand 2 feet to the left and knocked again. The section on the left sounded hollow. Maren sat back on her heels. Her pulse picked up in a way that had nothing to do with the work she had been doing. She had been around enough construction in her life. Adeline had fixed every leaking pipe and every broken wall in their apartment because the landlord would not. Maren had handed her the wrenches. She knew what a foundation was supposed to look like. Poured concrete, rebar, anchor bolts. Simple. Heavy. Honest. A sealed panel in the center of a foundation was not honest. Someone had built this on purpose. Someone had built this to hide something underneath. She walked into town that afternoon and borrowed a pry bar from Doreen's store. Doreen did not ask what she needed it for. She handed it over the counter and said, "Bring it back when you're done. Or don't." Maren walked back to the lot with the bar over her shoulder. Briggs followed at her heel the whole way. She worked through the rest of the afternoon. She fit the flat end of the bar into the seam and leaned her weight against it. The old sealant cracked and crumbled. The concrete panels shifted. Just an inch, but enough to confirm what she had suspected. There was a space underneath. She worked for 2 hours. The concrete was thick, maybe 4 inches deep, and heavy enough that she had to lever each section loose with the bar and the full weight of her body, and then drag it aside with both hands. Sweat ran down her back inside her shirt despite the cool October air. Briggs paced in circles around her. He whined. He sat. He stood. He whined again. By the time the opening was wide enough to see down through, the sun was at the western fence, and the shadows had grown long across the lot. Maren lay flat on her stomach and looked down. A chamber, maybe 6 feet deep, 4 feet across. The walls were poured concrete, smooth and dry. Not a crack, not a leak. Whoever had built this had built it to last 100 years, the same way they had built the foundation above it. And at the bottom of the chamber, resting on the dry concrete floor, was a wooden box wrapped in dark oilcloth. Maren stared at it. The September wind blew across the open lot and rattled a loose piece of steel somewhere behind her. Briggs leaned forward. His nose pointed straight down into the chamber and let out a single sharp bark. Something had been buried here. Buried carefully. Buried deliberately. Buried by someone who had wanted it found. She lowered herself down into the chamber slowly, one boot at a time. Her gloved hands on the concrete rim. The air at the bottom was colder than the air above. It smelled like damp earth and something older. Mineral. Stone that had not seen daylight in a long time. Her boots touched the concrete floor. She crouched. The box was about the size of a milk crate. The oilcloth was wrapped tight around it and tied with twine that had gone brittle. She lifted it. It was heavier than it looked. She passed it up over her head and set it on the slab, then climbed out after it. Briggs pressed his nose against the cloth, immediately sniffing every inch of the bundle. "Easy," Maren said. "Let me see what we've got." She sat cross-legged on the foundation and pulled her pocket knife from her jeans. She cut the twine. The oilcloth fell away in stiff folds, and a wooden box lay underneath, dovetailed at the corners, hinged at the back. Dark walnut. No lock. The wood had been smoothed and finished by a hand that knew what it was doing. She lifted the lid. Inside, packed tight and arranged with care, were 4 things. A leather-bound journal, the cover worn soft at the corners. A stack of photographs wrapped in wax paper. A bundle of papers tied with a faded blue ribbon. And a sealed envelope yellowed at the edges with handwriting across the front. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. The kind of penmanship that had been taught in schools by a generation that no longer existed. Maren picked the envelope up first. She turned it in her hands. The words on the front read, "To whoever carries the Holloway name forward." Her hands stopped. She read the line again. Holloway. Her name. Adeline's name. Her grandmother's name. The name Adeline had worn on her Social Security card, and her work uniform, and the small brass nameplate on the buzzer of their apartment building. The name on Maren's own birth certificate. The name she had carried through every shelter, every foster placement, every shelter intake form for the last 2 years. Holloway. She set the envelope down very carefully on the concrete beside her. Her hands had begun to shake and she did not want to drop it. She picked up the journal instead. The leather was cracked along the spine. The pages were stiff but intact. She opened to the first entry. The date at the top read, April 12th, 1955. The ink had faded to the color of weak tea, but the words were still legible. Started work on the municipal water system today. The council voted 6-1. Mayor Crandall shook my hand and said the town has been waiting 20 years for clean water. I told him we would have it running by fall. My name is Calvin Holloway, and I am the new water commissioner of Millbrook. Maren read it twice, then a third time. Calvin Holloway, water commissioner. The man who had built the tower she was sitting on. She turned the page with hands she could not steady. Calvin had written about pipe layouts and pump capacities, about digging trenches through July heat, about hiring a crew of 4 men and paying them out of a budget that did not quite stretch. He wrote about his wife, Eleanor, who brought him lunch at the worksite every day. He wrote about their daughter. Rosalind is 3 today. Eleanor made a cake with pink frosting, and Rosalind got it everywhere. In her hair, on the dog, on my good shirt. I don't care. She is the best thing I have ever built. Maren stopped. She stared at the page until her vision blurred and the letters swam together. Rosalind. Her mother's name had been Rosalind. Rosalind Holloway, who had died in a car accident on a stretch of Ohio highway when Maren was 4 years old. Rosalind, whom Maren barely remembered except for the smell of her shampoo and the sound of her voice singing something low and tuneless in a kitchen that Maren could not picture anymore. Maren laid the journal across her knees and unwrapped the photographs with hands that no longer felt like her own. The first photograph showed a young man in work clothes. He stood in front of a steel framework, grinning at the camera, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. He was tall, lean, dark-haired. His jaw was a jaw she had seen every morning of her life in whatever mirror was available to her. Behind him rose the half-built skeleton of a water tower, reaching up into a clear summer sky. Calvin Holloway, her grandfather. She turned the photograph over. Someone had written on the back in pencil, Summer 1955, tower frame week 6. The next photograph showed Calvin standing on the porch of a small white farmhouse, his arm around a woman with kind eyes and light hair pulled back in a low bun. The woman held a baby wrapped in a white blanket. Eleanor, the wife, the grandmother Maren had never known. The next photograph stopped her breath. A little girl, maybe 5 or 6, sat on the seat of a green tractor. Calvin stood beside her with one hand on the wheel and one hand on her shoulder. The little girl had dark hair tied back in pigtails and a gap-toothed smile that Maren had only ever seen in one other place in her life. There was a single photograph of her own mother as a child, the one Adeline had kept on the dresser in their apartment. The one that had been folded into the lining of Maren's duffel bag for the last 2 years. The smile was the same eyes, the same gap, the same small chin. Rosalind at 6, riding the tractor on the farm her father had bought with a water commissioner's salary, in a Nebraska town Maren had never heard of until 10 days ago. The sun had dropped below the western fence. The wind moved across the open lot and lifted the corner of the wax paper and set it back down. Somewhere out on Tower Road, a vehicle was approaching. Slow. The crunch of tires on gravel. Maren did not hear it. She was looking at the photograph of her mother on a tractor, and she was crying without making any sound at all. The tears ran down her face and dropped onto the back of her work glove and soaked into the leather. She had a grandfather. She had a grandfather who had lived in this town, who had built this tower with his own hands, who had stood in front of it in summer 1955 and grinned for a camera held by a wife he loved, who had taught her mother to drive a tractor at the age of 6. She had a grandfather, and he had sealed a box of his life into the foundation of the thing he had built, and he had written a letter to whoever came next, and the letter was addressed to her name, Holloway. Briggs whined and pressed his ribs against her side. He could feel her shaking through the bones of his shoulder. He laid his head on her thigh and did not move. Out on Tower Road, the headlights of a black Cadillac SUV swept slowly along the chain-link fence. The vehicle did not stop. It rolled past at a walking pace. The driver's side window was down 2 inches. Maren did not see it. She was bent over the photograph of her mother as a child, and her shoulders were shaking. And Briggs was the only living thing in the world that knew she was crying. The SUV continued down Tower Road. At the bend before the highway, it slowed to a halt. A man in his mid-40s sat behind the wheel, broad in the shoulders, gray at the temples. His face lit only by the green glow of the dashboard. He watched the lot in his rearview mirror for nearly a full minute. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. "She found something," he said. "I want to know what it is by tomorrow morning." He hung up. He shifted into drive. The taillights bled away into the dusk and disappeared on the foundation of the tower. Her grandfather had built 61 years before. She was born, Maren Holloway sat in the last of the daylight with a leather journal open on her knees and a photograph of her mother in her hand, and a stray dog pressed against her side. She did not know yet what she had walked into. She did not know yet that the man in the Cadillac had been watching her since the day she signed her name on the deed in the county clerk's office. She did not know that the family who had driven her grandfather out of this town 60 years ago had been waiting for the chance to take it back from him one final time. But Briggs knew something. He stood up suddenly. His ears went forward toward the road. He stared into the dark beyond the gate, and the low rumble started in his chest. And he did not stop watching the road until the last of the engine noise had faded into the prairie wind. Maren wiped her face with her sleeve. She gathered the journal and the photographs and the bundle of papers in the sealed envelope. She wrapped them back in the oilcloth and held the bundle against her chest with both arms. She stood up slowly, on legs that did not quite feel like her own. She walked to the tarp shelter on the north edge of the foundation and crawled inside. The stars were coming out, the same enormous stars she had seen her first night on this lot. She lay on her back and held the oilcloth bundle to her chest, like a child holds a stuffed animal in the dark. Briggs lay across her boots and watched the gate. Somewhere behind them, a piece of loose steel rattled in the night wind. Somewhere beyond the fence on a road, Maren had not yet learned to fear a black Cadillac SUV, waited at the edge of the prairie, and did not turn its lights on. She read by the light of a propane lantern Doreen had loaned her, and she did not sleep that night. The lantern hissed. Briggs lay across the entrance of the tarp shelter, with his back to the wind. The journal was open on her crossed legs, and Maren turned the pages slowly, the way a person turns the pages of a book that holds the answer to a question they did not know they had been asking their whole life. The first years were good years. Calvin Holloway had finished the water system in 1956, a year ahead of schedule. The town threw a celebration on the courthouse lawn. He wrote about it the next morning. The diner brought out 3 pots of coffee. The mayor gave a speech about clean water for every home in Millbrook. A woman Calvin did not know walked up to him and shook his hand and said her son had stopped getting sick because the well water on their farm was no longer the only water her family drank. He wrote about Eleanor pinning a blue ribbon to his work shirt and laughing at him. He wrote about Rosalind turning 4 and asking him if she could be a water commissioner when she grew up. And he wrote that he had said yes. And then he had written one line under that and underlined it twice. She can be anything. This town is the kind of place where a child can be anything. Maren read that line 3 times. The pages that followed were full of the slow, satisfied work of a man who loved his job. Pump maintenance schedules. Training a part-time assistant named Halvor. The pleasure of a system that worked the way it was supposed to. There were small drawings in the margins. Pipe joints. Valve seats. A sketch of a new fitting Calvin had designed to reduce wear on the main intake. Then, somewhere around the spring of 1959, the tone of the writing changed. A man named Silas Penhallow had moved into the county. He had bought up farmland east of Millbrook, 300 acres in the first year, another 400 the year after. He wanted to develop the land. He wanted to put houses on it. He wanted to bring new residents to a town that had been losing them for 2 decades. But the land was no good without water. The town's municipal supply, the one Calvin had built, was the only reliable source for 10 miles in any direction. Silas Penhallow needed access to it, and the way he intended to get that access was by buying it. He came to the town council with a proposal. He would invest in expanding the water system and laying new lines east toward his land and upgrading the pumps. In exchange, the town would grant him development rights to the supply. He would have the authority to determine who got connected, who paid what, who got served and who did not. Calvin opposed it. He wrote about it in plain, hard language. Penhallow does not want to improve the system. He wants to own it. Once he controls the water, he controls who builds where, who pays what, who gets served. I told the council this at the meeting on March 11th. Half of them listened. The other half were looking at the check Penhallow was holding up like a flag. Maren read on. The lantern hissed. Outside, the prairie wind moved across the lot and pressed against the tarp. The entries grew darker. Silas Penhallow started a campaign. Not in the open. Not where Calvin could face him. Rumors began to move through Millbrook the way smoke moves through a closed room. Quiet, slow, impossible to wave away. The water commissioner had been mismanaging funds. The water commissioner had been buying tools on the town's account and taking them home. The water commissioner had a brother in Lincoln who had received contracts that should have gone to local men. None of it was true. Calvin requested an audit. The county sent 2 accountants from Omaha. They spent 11 days at the courthouse with every receipt and every invoice Calvin had ever signed. They reported back to the town council in October of 1960. The audit found nothing wrong. Every dollar was accounted for. Every contract was clean. But the damage had already been done. In November, 2 of the council members who had supported Calvin lost their seats in the local election. They were replaced by men who had been seen drinking with Silas Penhallow at the tavern on the south end of Main Street. In January of 1961, a 3rd council member resigned for what the paper called personal reasons. He was replaced by a man Silas Penhallow had personally recommended. In March of 1961, the council voted 4-3. They did not fire Calvin. That would have been illegal. They eliminated the position of water commissioner. They created a new position with a different title. Director of Public Utilities. Same job. Different name. Different person. The new director was a man Silas Penhallow had brought up from Kansas City. It was legal, technically. Everyone in Millbrook knew what had happened. Maren could feel Calvin's anger in the handwriting on those pages. The letters pressed harder into the paper. The lines were less even. He had been writing fast the way a man writes when his hand is trying to keep up with what is happening inside his chest. The next entries were short, written over the course of a week. Calvin had decided to seal the foundation. He described the process in careful, technical language. He mixed the concrete himself. He poured the inner walls of the chamber over 3 nights, working alone after the new director had gone home for the day. He waterproofed the interior with 2 coats of asphalt sealant. He placed the box inside. He set the upper panel into the seam with a thin layer of caulk and covered the surface with a layer of fresh gravel so that it would look like part of the foundation. He wrote one line at the end of that section. "If they take everything else, they cannot take what is buried in the thing I built with my own hands." That was the last entry Calvin Holloway wrote in Millbrook. The next entry was dated 2 weeks later from a motel in Kearney. We left, Eleanor and Rosalind and me. I loaded what I could into the truck, and we drove west. Eleanor is sick. She will not say how bad. I can see it in her color. Rosalind cried the whole first day. She is 8 years old. Old enough to know we are running. Too young to understand why. Maren closed the journal. She sat in the dark of the tarp shelter with the propane lantern hissing at her feet and the wind pressing against the walls and Briggs breathing against her knee. She did not move for a long time. She had spent her entire life believing she came from nothing, that her name had no weight behind it, that she had been passed along through the system because there was nobody at the other end of the chain who wanted her. Adeline had been the exception. Adeline had taken her in when Rosalind died, had braided her hair every morning, had taught her to fix a leaking pipe and patch a hole in drywall, and thread a needle with one hand. Adeline had been everything. And when Adeline had died when Maren was 14 years old, and the state came to take her, she had assumed that was the pattern. People leave. That was what they did. But Calvin Holloway had not left because he wanted to. He had been driven out. She walked into Millbrook the next morning carrying the journal and the photographs in a folded grocery bag. She had not slept. Her eyes felt like someone had rubbed sand into them. Briggs trotted at her heel, his bad paw barely showing the limp anymore. Doreen was stacking boxes of 3-inch deck screws onto the shelf at the front of the hardware store when Maren walked in. She took one look at Maren's face and set the box down on the counter. What happened? Maren laid the journal on the counter. She opened it to the first page. Then she set the photograph of Calvin standing in front of the half-built tower beside it. Doreen leaned forward. She put on the reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. She read the first line of the entry. Then she looked at the photograph. Then she looked at Maren. "Calvin Holloway," Doreen said slowly. "He was my grandfather." Doreen was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "My father knew him." She walked around the counter and turned the sign on the door from open to back in 15. She walked back. She picked up the photograph in her thick fingers and held it to the light from the front window. "My father was a county surveyor," Doreen said. "He worked alongside Calvin Holloway on the water system in 1955 and 1956. He used to tell me when I was a girl that Calvin Holloway was the most honest man he had ever met in Millbrook. He said it like a kind of warning, like he wanted me to know that an honest man was a rare thing and worth remembering." She set the photograph down. Then one day, Calvin was gone. My father did not talk about it again until he was dying. He told me the night before he died that the town had let something bad happen to Calvin Holloway. He said it was the one thing in his life he was ashamed of having stood by for. Maren held very still. "What did your father do?" she asked. Doreen did not answer right away. "He did nothing," Doreen said. That was the shame of it. She walked Maren into the back room of the store. There was a filing cabinet against the wall, the kind that had stood in offices all over America in the middle of the last century. She pulled open the second drawer from the top. She riffled through old folders with hands that knew exactly what they were looking for. And she lifted out a manila folder marked Town Records Miscellaneous, 1955 to 1965. She laid the folder on the workbench. Inside were photocopies, meeting minutes from the town council. property transfers, commission appointments. Some of them were so faded that Doreen had to hold them sideways under the lamp to read them. But the information was there. August 1955, Doreen said, tapping a page with one finger. Calvin Holloway appointed water commissioner. Unanimous vote. She turned the page. She turned another. March 1961. Motion to restructure the Water Commission. Sponsored by council members Pruitt Dawson and Penhallow. Maren's eyes moved down the page. Penhallow. Silas Penhallow, Doreen said. Sat on the council for 2 years. Stepped down after he got what he wanted. His son ran the family company after that. His grandson runs it now. She looked at Maren. Garrett Penhallow. Maren did not know the name yet. She would learn it before the day was out. Doreen pulled another file from the cabinet. This one was thinner. A few photocopied newspaper clippings from the Millbrook Register. She handed them across the workbench. The top clipping was dated September 14th, 1961. A small article in the local section. Local Water Commissioner position restructured. The article said almost nothing. It used the words modernization and efficiency. It did not name Calvin Holloway anywhere in the text. The second clipping was from October 2nd, 1961. Holloway family moves from Millbrook. 3 short paragraphs. The Holloway family had relocated to be closer to extended relatives in Missouri. The wife's health was cited. There was no mention of the water commissioner's job. No mention of the audit. No mention of Silas Penhallow. The third clipping was from June of 1962. Penhallow Land Development announces expansion east of Millbrook. The article ran 2 full columns. It included a photograph of Silas Penhallow standing in front of a wheat field with his arm around a man in a suit from the bank. The article quoted Silas Penhallow as saying that the project would not have been possible without the new vision at the town's public utilities department. Maren read the article twice. He took everything, she said quietly. He took the job. Then he took the land. Then he wrote the story so nobody would remember it had ever belonged to anyone else. Yes, Doreen said. That is exactly what he did. Maren walked out of the hardware store into the October sunlight. Briggs lifted his head from the patch of grass where he had been waiting and fell in beside her without a sound. She was halfway down Main Street when she saw the SUV. Black. Tinted windows, new tires. Parked across the street from Rosalie's diner. She had seen it twice from the lot. She had seen it once from the corner of her eye while walking back from the courthouse 3 days ago. She had not been sure. She was sure now. She kept walking. She did not turn her head. She did not change her pace. Briggs walked at her heel and did not look at the SUV either. But his ears were forward and his shoulders were tight under the fur. The driver's side window was rolled down 2 inches. She could not see the face, only the shape of a man behind the wheel. She walked all the way back to the lot. She did not look behind her until she was through the gate and the gate was closed. The SUV had not followed. She sat down on the foundation. She put her hands flat on the concrete on either side of her. She closed her eyes and tried to slow her breathing. The truck came to the lot 2 hours later. It was not the SUV. It was a dark green pickup truck, an older model, the kind a man drives when he has owned it for 30 years and is not interested in trading it in. It pulled up at the open gate and stopped. The engine cut off. A man stepped out. He was in his early 70s, white hair under a canvas hat, bigger across the shoulders than time had managed to take from him. He wore a flannel shirt tucked into work pants and carried a toolbox in his left hand, the kind made of red painted steel, with the latch worn smooth by 40 years of opening and closing. He stood at the gate. He did not come through. Maren stood up from the foundation. "I have been watching you," the man said. His voice was low and even. 3 weeks. I live about a quarter-mile that way. He nodded east toward a low farmhouse Maren could just see through a stand of cottonwoods. "What do you want?" Maren said. She was tired. Her voice came out flatter than she had meant. "I want to see if you would stick with it." The man set the toolbox down on the gravel just inside the gate. "Most people would have quit by day 3. You have been here for 21 days. You have been moving rubble by hand. You have a dog now. You have a foundation cleared." He paused. He looked at her with eyes that were a faded clear blue, the color of denim that has been washed for a lifetime. "I do not need anything from you. I am a carpenter, retired. My wife died 2 years ago. I have been making birdhouses in my garage to fill the time. My daughter says I have made enough birdhouses for every bird in the state. I do not disagree." He opened the lid of the toolbox. Inside were hammers, a tape measure, a framing square, a set of chisels in a leather roll that had been oiled and cared for over decades. "You have a foundation," the man said. "You do not have a structure. If you want help framing something, I can help." Maren did not answer right away. She studied him. He stood with his weight a little to the left, the way a man stands when his right knee is no longer what it was. His hands were steady. His eyes did not move. He was not selling her anything. "Why?" she said. The man looked past her at the foundation, at the cleared rim, at the piles of sorted rubble along the fence line. Then he looked back at her. "Because I'm 72 years old and I'm tired of building birdhouses," he said. "And because my wife, Caroline, she would have been out here on day 1 with a thermos of coffee and a stack of 2x4s. She was that kind of person. I am slower than she was. But I am here." Briggs walked across the lot toward him. He sniffed the man's boots. He sat down beside the toolbox. Maren let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "I cannot pay you," she said. "Did not ask for pay. What is your name?" "Nolan Sutherland." He held out his hand across the gate. Maren walked the rest of the way to meet it. His palm was rough and dry. His grip was firm without being a contest. "Maren Holloway," she said. Nolan held her hand a second longer than he needed to. Something moved in his face, a small twitch at the corner of his eye. Then it was gone. "Holloway," he said. "All right then." He picked up the toolbox and came through the gate. That afternoon he taught her how to lay out a wall. They worked on the foundation. He showed her how to measure twice and cut once. He showed her how to check a corner with a framing square. He showed her how to plumb a post with a level. He was patient in the way of a man who had taught these things before and did not mind teaching them again. He let her make the cut wrong the first time. He let her see why it was wrong before he corrected her. When she set a nail clean on the first swing, he grunted in a way that was not quite approval and not quite anything else. And she felt something warm move through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. They did not talk much. Once, while she was holding the end of his tape measure against the edge of the foundation, he asked her where she had learned to work with her hands. "My grandmother," she said. "Adeline Holloway. She raised me after my mother died. She worked 2 cleaning jobs. The landlord would not fix anything in our building, so she did. She taught me how to do everything she knew how to do." Nolan was quiet for a moment. "Adeline Holloway," he said. "Yes, that is a good name to come from." She did not understand what he meant by that. She let it pass. By the end of the first day they had worked together, they had the skeleton of a wall section lying flat on the foundation. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Nolan straightened his back slowly. He pressed one hand into the small of his spine. He looked at the wall. "That is solid work," he said. "I had a good teacher today." He looked at her. Then he looked away out across the lot at the long shadows the late sun was throwing across the gravel. "You have a name that means something in this town," he said. "I do not know if anyone has told you that yet." Maren said nothing. Nolan picked up his toolbox. "I will be back tomorrow morning." He walked to his truck. The engine started on the second turn of the key. He drove down Tower Road toward the cottonwoods, and the dust settled behind him. And Maren stood on the foundation alone with Briggs and watched the sun fall behind the western fence. She had not yet read all of the journal. She had read the front half. She had read the entries from Millbrook. She had read the entries from the motel in Kearney where Eleanor was sick. And Rosalind was crying and Calvin was writing in a notebook by the light of a roadside lamp because he could not sleep, and he could not stop, and he could not bear to do nothing. She had read up to the last entry from 1963, 3 lines long, written from a rented room in Missouri. "Eleanor's treatment is expensive. Rosalind needs new shoes. The bonds are safe. Someday I will go back for them. The bonds." She had not yet untied the blue ribbon on the bundle of papers in the oilcloth bundle. She did it that night by lantern light with Briggs lying across her boots. The papers inside were savings bonds, United States, Series E. The dates were stamped in dark red ink at the upper right corner of each one. The earliest was from June of 1956. The latest was from November of 1962. There were 16 bonds in the bundle. The face values ranged from $50 to $500. They had been purchased one at a time in small amounts, the way a man buys them when he is saving from a salary that does not have much room in it. Maren counted them 3 times. She did not know exactly what matured United States savings bonds were worth. She knew they grew over time. She knew these were more than half a century old. She also did not yet know what to do with them. She wrapped them back in the wax paper and tied the blue ribbon around them and put them inside the wooden box and closed the lid and pushed the box deep into the corner of the tarp shelter. Under the folded clothes she used as a pillow, she lay down. Briggs lay across the entrance. She did not sleep that night either. The next morning, Nolan Sutherland came back at 7:30 with 2 thermoses of coffee and a paper bag of biscuits from the diner. He set both thermoses on the foundation and opened the bag and did not say a word about how she looked. He poured her a cup of coffee. He waited. They worked. By noon, they had the wall section standing. It was 12 feet long and 8 feet high. Nolan had braced it with 2 angled 2x4s running down to the slab. The wood was not new. He had pulled it out of a stack in his garage that had been there since 1992. But it was straight, and it was dry, and the wall was square. It looked like the beginning of a house. Maren stood back and looked at it. She did not realize Nolan was watching her until he spoke. "Calvin Holloway built things to last," he said. Maren turned her head. Nolan was looking at the wall, not at her. He had a screwdriver in one hand and was tightening the bolts that held the angled brace. "You knew him," she said quietly. "I did not." Nolan did not look up. "I was 4 years old when he left this town. I do not remember the man at all, but my father knew him." He set the screwdriver down. He turned to face her. "My father served on the town council in 1961. Maren felt the morning go very still. The wind was still moving across the lot. Briggs was still lying in his patch of sun. The sky was still the same hard October blue. But something inside Maren had stopped. Nolan held her eyes. "I am not going to talk about it today," he said. "Not yet. There is something I need to do first. There is something I need to bring you. But I am telling you now before we go any further with this house, because you should know who you are letting onto your property." He paused. "You decide if you want me to come back tomorrow." He picked up his toolbox. He walked to his truck. He did not look back. The truck started. The truck pulled out onto Tower Road. The truck disappeared around the bend toward the cottonwoods, the same as it had the day before. Maren stood beside the wall. Her grandfather's daughter's daughter had helped to raise. The sun was warm on the back of her neck. Briggs sat up. He looked at her. He whined once low in his throat. She walked over to him. She knelt. She pressed her forehead against the top of his head and held it there. "I do not know," she said. He licked her wrist. She drove May's truck into town that afternoon. May had loaned it to her without question when Maren had said she needed to go to the bank. The First National Bank of Millbrook stood on the corner of Main and 4th. Brick. 2 stories. A flagpole in front. Maren walked in with the bundle of bonds in a manila envelope she had bought at the drugstore next door. She wore the cleanest clothes she owned. She had washed her face in the courthouse bathroom and combed her hair with her fingers and tried to look like a person who belonged at the counter of a bank. The teller was a young man who looked at the bonds and looked at Maren and excused himself. The manager came out a moment later. A woman in her 50s named Mrs. Porter with steel gray hair cut short and a navy blazer. She brought Maren into a small office at the back. She closed the door. She spread the bonds across her desk one at a time. She put on glasses. She began entering numbers into a calculator. She entered them for a long time. When she was done, she set the calculator down. She took off her glasses. She folded her hands on the desk. "Miss Holloway," she said, "do you understand what these are?" "Savings bonds. From my grandfather. These are Series E United States savings bonds issued between 1956 and 1962. They have all reached final maturity. They have been earning interest for over 50 years. Maren held very still. "How much?" she said. Mrs. Porter looked at her with an expression Maren would remember for a long time. "The combined redemption value of these 16 bonds," she said, "is $52,341. The number did not register at first. It sounded like a sentence in a foreign language. Maren heard the words. They did not connect to anything real. "I am sorry," she said. "How much?" $52,341. Maren gripped the arms of the chair. The room narrowed to a point, and then expanded and then narrowed again. She had never in her life had more than $400 at one time. Mrs. Porter waited. She did not say anything else. She let Maren breathe. When Maren walked out of the bank 20 minutes later, the October light was sharp and clean across Main Street, and Briggs was waiting in the passenger seat of May's truck, and a black Cadillac SUV was parked across the street in front of the post office. The driver's side window was down. A man was leaning against the hood. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, gray at the temples. He wore a dark wool coat that was wrong for the weather, and a watch that caught the sun. He was looking directly at her. When their eyes met, he straightened. He pushed off the hood of the SUV. He raised one hand in greeting, slow and deliberate. Then he smiled, and it was a smile that did not have any warmth in it at all. He crossed the street toward her. Briggs began to growl from inside the truck. "Miss Holloway," the man said. He stopped about 6 feet away, close enough that she could see the small scar that ran along the line of his jaw. far enough that he was not crowding her. He had done this kind of thing before. He knew the distances. "My name is Garrett Penhallow." He held out a business card between two fingers. Maren did not take it. He did not lower the card. He simply waited. And then, when it became clear she would not take it, he set it carefully on the hood of the truck beside her right hand. "I have been looking forward to meeting you," he said. "I think we have a great deal to talk about." He smiled again. The same smile. No warmth. "Welcome to Millbrook." Briggs did not stop growling. Maren held very still. She did not pick up the card. She did not step back. She had learned over 2 years of living on the road that men who carried themselves the way Garrett Penhallow carried himself counted on you to step back. They counted on the half-second of fear that gave them their opening. She did not give it to him. "What do we have to talk about?" she said. "That parcel of yours." "It is a parcel. It is more than that." Garrett Penhallow lifted his chin slightly. The sun caught the gray at his temples. He let the silence stretch. "That parcel was slated for commercial rezoning in the 2014 master plan," he said. "The county had a contractual interest in holding it for development. Somebody at the assessor's office made a mistake when they put it in the surplus auction. I am filing a formal challenge with the Board of Supervisors. Until that challenge is resolved, I would strongly advise you not to make any further modifications to the property." He paused. "I am being polite, Miss Holloway. I am being polite because I believe in being polite. But this property was promised to my family, and my family does not lose things that have been promised to it." Maren felt Briggs's growl drop lower in his throat. She did not look away from Garrett's face. "That land has belonged to my family longer than you have been alive," she said. Something flickered across Garrett's eyes. It was the smallest thing, a tightening at the corner. But she saw it, and he knew she had seen it. And for 1/2 second, the smile was not on his face. Then it came back. "Your family." He let the word sit there. "Let us be careful with that word, Miss Holloway. People sometimes claim relationships they cannot prove." Calvin Holloway built that water tower in 1955. Calvin Holloway left this town in 1961. His voice did not rise. It got quieter. He left under a cloud, if I recall the family history correctly. Mismanagement, irregularities, the kind of thing that follows a man no matter where he goes. Maren's hand closed on the doorframe of the truck. "That is not what happened." "That is what the record says." "The record is wrong." Garrett smiled. "The record," he said softly, "is the record." He turned and walked back across Main Street. He did not look back. He climbed into the Cadillac and started the engine and pulled away from the curb, without hurry the way a man who owns the road drives down it. Maren watched the SUV disappear around the corner, past the post office. She picked up the business card from the hood of May's truck. Garrett Penhallow. Penhallow Development. President and Chief Executive Officer. An Omaha address. 3 phone numbers. She tore the card in half, then in quarters, and dropped the pieces into the gutter, where the rain ran down toward the storm drain. The letter from Garrett Penhallow's attorney arrived 3 days later, by certified mail at Doreen's hardware store. Doreen brought it out to the lot herself. She drove the dark green pickup that had once belonged to her husband and parked at the gate and walked across the gravel with the envelope in her hand. Her mouth was a flat line. "He filed it formally," she said. 2 attorneys from Omaha. The hearing is set for the 2nd week of November, 3 weeks out." Maren read the letter standing up. The language was thick and bureaucratic, but the meaning came through. Penhallow Development was formally challenging the surplus auction sale of Lot 14. on the grounds that the parcel had been improperly listed. The county was on notice. The Board of Supervisors would conduct a public hearing. Until that hearing was held, the letter strongly advised the new property owner to refrain from any construction or modification of the property. Maren handed the letter back to Doreen. "He cannot stop me from building," she said. "He can make it expensive if you build wrong." "What is wrong?" "Anything he can argue is wrong." Doreen folded the letter and put it back into the envelope. She looked across the foundation at the wall section Maren and Nolan had raised the week before. It stood square and clean in the morning light, braced with the angled 2x4s. "Nolan come back yet?" Doreen asked. "No. He will. He said there was something he had to do first." Doreen nodded slowly. "There is," she said. "He has been carrying it for a long time. You let him carry it the way he needs to. Do not push him." She did not say more. She walked back to her truck. She drove away. Maren stood on the foundation with the wind moving across the lot, and the letter from the attorney still ringing in her ears. And she thought about the 3 weeks she had before the hearing. She thought about the bonds in the wooden box under the folded clothes in her tarp shelter. She thought about her grandfather sealing this foundation with his own hands in the spring of 1961, knowing that everything he had built was being taken from him and choosing to bury what he had left, rather than let it be taken too. She thought about Garrett Penhallow's smile. She walked over to the wall and picked up the framing hammer Nolan had left leaning against it. She drove the next nail in herself. The first cut hanger of fence wire happened on a Tuesday night. She did not see it happen. She had walked into town for a can of beans and a loaf of bread. And when she came back, the western corner of the chain link had been clipped clean through the wire. Bent inward and folded back like the petal of a metal flower, there was a piece of yellow legal paper pinned to the bent wire with a roofing nail. The handwriting was a child's printing made deliberately childlike to disguise the hand behind it. Block letters, no flourishes. "Sell it now while you still can." Maren read the note. She read it twice. Her hand was steady when she folded it and put it into her back pocket. She walked into Doreen's store the next morning and bought 30 feet of new chain link, 2 posts, a roll of barbed wire, and a heavy pair of fence pliers. Doreen rang it up at cost and did not say anything about the bill she was building. Maren mended the fence by herself that afternoon. She added the barbed wire across the top of the gate. She did not tell Doreen about the note. Nolan Sutherland came back to the lot 4 days after he had walked away. She heard the truck before she saw it. 7:30 in the morning. The same dark green pickup. He pulled up at the gate and cut the engine. He sat in the cab for a moment with both hands on the wheel. Then he opened the door and stepped out. And Maren saw that he had a wooden box under his right arm, smaller than a milk crate, dark with age, the corners darker still where a man's thumb had rested on them for a long time. He walked through the gate. Briggs went to him and pressed against his leg without being called. Nolan rested a hand on the dog's head and did not seem to notice he was doing it. "I owe you a conversation," Nolan said. "All right. Not here. Up at the house. Caroline's house. My house. If you do not mind, there is something I want to show you. And I want to show it to you sitting down at a table." She went with him. She had not been off the lot for anything but town errands in 3 weeks. Sitting in the cab of Nolan's truck, watching the cottonwoods slide past, she felt the strangeness of being driven somewhere, of trusting the man behind the wheel to take her where he said he was going to take her. Briggs sat between them on the bench seat with his head on Maren's thigh. The farmhouse was small, white clapboard, a wide porch with 2 rocking chairs that had not been moved in 2 years. Inside, the kitchen had yellow walls and an old wooden table and a refrigerator that hummed loud enough to hear through the floor. There were photographs on the fridge held up with magnets. A woman with red going to gray hair standing in a garden. The same woman in a wedding dress, much younger, beside a man Maren did not at first recognize as Nolan. He saw her looking. "Caroline," he said. "She passed in the spring 2 years ago. Pancreatic. It was fast." He set the wooden box on the kitchen table. He pulled out a chair for Maren. He pulled out one for himself. He sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table and looked at the box for a long time before he spoke. "My father," he said. "His name was Wendell Sutherland. He died in 1989. I was a younger man then, 45. He died slow, lung cancer. He had been a heavy smoker his whole life. The doctor gave him 8 months. He took 14. The last 3 of those months, he barely got out of bed." He paused. He did not look up from the box. "The night before he died, he asked me to come into his room and close the door. He had something he wanted to give me. He said he had been carrying it for almost 30 years. He said he could not take it with him." Nolan opened the box. Inside, lying flat against the wood, was a folded piece of paper, yellowed. The folds had been made decades ago and had not been opened many times since. Below the paper was a small brown envelope, the kind a bank uses for cash. Nolan lifted out the paper. He unfolded it. He turned it around and slid it across the table to Maren. "He wrote this 6 weeks before he died," Nolan said. "He gave it to me the night before. He made me promise I would not destroy it. He said it was the only honest thing he had to leave behind." Maren read it. The handwriting was shaky. A dying man's hand. But the words were clear. It was a confession, written by Wendell Sutherland in the fall of 1989. He named himself. He named the year, 1961. He named the man who had paid him, Silas Penhallow. He named the amount, $2,000 in cash, delivered in a paper bag in the parking lot of a tavern on the south end of Main Street. 3 days before the council vote that restructured the position of water commissioner, he named 2 other council members who had taken the same money. He named the man who had brokered the meeting between Penhallow and the council members willing to be bought. He named the date and the place and the time. And at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that had pressed harder than the rest, he had written one sentence. "I have lived 30 years as a man who took money to ruin Calvin Holloway, and I am about to die as one. And the only thing I ask is that someone someday makes this right." Maren read it twice. She set the paper down on the table. She put her hands flat on the wood on either side of it. She did not cry. There was no crying for this. This was something else. This was the bottom of a well she had been falling into for 3 weeks, finally rising up to meet her. "Your father took the money," she said. Her voice came out quiet. "Yes." "To vote against my grandfather?" "Yes." Nolan did not move. He sat with his hands folded on the table. He waited. "Why are you giving me this?" she said. Nolan looked at her then, looked her in the eyes for the first time since she had sat down. "I have carried this for 27 years, he said. "I knew my father was a coward. I knew he had done a bad thing. I did not know there would ever be a Holloway to give it to. I did not know what to do with it. I built birdhouses in my garage for 2 years after Caroline died because I could not think of anything else to build. And the whole time I had this box on a shelf above my workbench. And I never opened it." He paused. "Then I drove past a half-acre of cleared rubble 3 weeks ago, and I saw a young woman doing by hand what a town full of men should have done 8 years ago. And I came home and I climbed up on the workbench and I took the box down. He pushed the brown envelope across the table. "That is the $2,000, he said. "My father put it in a bank account in 1961 and never touched it. I have not touched it. It has been earning interest for 55 years. It is yours. I do not want any of it. I do not want it in my house anymore." Maren did not open the envelope. She slid it back across the table toward him. "I do not want his money. It is not his money. It is your grandfather's money. It always was. I do not want it." Nolan looked at her. "Then we will figure out what to do with it together," he said. "But you keep this confession. You do not give it back to me. You do not show it to anyone yet. You hold it. There is a hearing coming. There is a man named Penhallow who is going to stand in front of a board of supervisors and lie about your grandfather one more time. When he does, you stand up. You take this paper out of your pocket. You read it out loud. And you finish the work my father started the night before he died." Maren sat very still. She looked at the confession. She looked at Nolan. She looked at his hands folded on the table. The hands of a man who had built birdhouses in a garage for 2 years because he could not build anything else. She reached across the table. She took both of his hands in hers. She held them. Nolan Sutherland was 72 years old, and he was not a man who cried. He had not cried at his wife's funeral. He had not cried at his father's funeral. He did not cry at this table either. But his eyes filled and he did not pull his hands away. And for a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside the kitchen window, Briggs lifted his head from the porch boards and stared east toward the road, toward the lot, toward whatever was coming. The week before the hearing, the second cut to the fence happened. This time it was on the north side. A 4-foot section laid back like a door. 2 of the support posts had been worked loose with a crowbar and left leaning. There was no note this time. There did not need to be. The message was the absence of a message. Maren mended the fence. Then a third thing happened, and this one she did not mend. She had driven into town in May's truck to pick up a sack of nails. On the way back, she took the long road past the south edge of the county. It was a quiet road. She had taken it before. She had no reason to expect anything. The pickup came up behind her fast. No plates on the front. She watched it come in the rearview mirror. A man behind the wheel in a baseball cap pulled low. He pulled out into the oncoming lane to pass her. And then at the last possible second, he cut sideways and clipped the front quarter of her bumper. The truck went off the road. She held the wheel. She did not brake. She had learned that much somewhere from someone. She let the truck roll down into the ditch with the gravel pulling sideways under the tires, and the truck stopped before it hit the fence line, and the engine stalled, and the silence rushed in. The pickup did not stop. It drove on. She watched it go. She sat in the driver's seat with both hands on the wheel for almost a full minute. Then she opened the door and climbed out into the ditch and walked around to the front of the truck. The bumper was creased. One headlight was cracked. The truck was drivable. She got back in. She started it. She drove the rest of the way to the lot at 30 miles an hour, both hands on the wheel. Her teeth pressed together so hard her jaw ached. She told Nolan that night. She did not tell Doreen. Nolan sat on the foundation with her after dark. He had built a small fire in a ring of stones. He poured coffee from a thermos into 2 enamel cups. He did not speak for a long time. Then he stood up. He walked to his truck. He came back with a long canvas case. He unzipped it. Inside was a Remington 870, a pump-action shotgun, 12-gauge, with a stock that had been worn smooth by his father's hand and then by his own. He laid it across his knees and looked at her over the fire. "I'm going to sleep out here tonight," he said, "and tomorrow night, and every night until that hearing is over. I am not asking your permission. I am telling you what is going to happen." Maren did not argue. Briggs lay between them with his back to the fire. The storm came 2 nights later. It came up out of the southwest, the way October storms come up over the plains fast and low and full of cold rain. The wind hit the lot first. The tarp shelter pulled at its anchors. The wall section Maren and Nolan had raised held square against the gusts because Nolan had braced it well, but the loose pieces of steel along the fence rattled like teeth. Maren and Nolan sat inside the frame wall under a second tarp Nolan had rigged across the bracing as a temporary roof. They had a kerosene lantern between them. The light moved in the wind. Briggs lay at the edge of the lantern light, his head up his ears forward. The first man came over the south fence at 10:30. Briggs caught him before he had taken 3 steps. The dog moved silently across the gravel and hit him at the knee, and the man went down hard on the wet ground. And the second man came over the fence behind him, and the third one came through the gate, and Maren was on her feet before she understood she was on her feet. Nolan stood up beside her. He racked the Remington once. The sound carried. The 2 men in the gate stopped. "This is private property," Nolan said. His voice was even. "Step back across that fence." The man on the ground rolled. Briggs stood over him with his lip pulled back and his teeth showing white in the lantern light. The second man took a step forward. Nolan raised the barrel of the shotgun into the sky and fired 1 round. The thunderclap of it rolled across the prairie. Somewhere out on the highway, a truck horn answered. The men ran. The man on the ground scrambled up, holding his bleeding leg, and limped toward the south fence. Briggs let him go. The other 2 were already over the fence and into the dark. The sound of an engine started somewhere out beyond the tree line and faded fast. The sheriff's deputy arrived 22 minutes later. A young man named Aldous in a tan jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that the rain had darkened. He took Maren's statement. He took Nolan's statement. He walked the south fence with a flashlight. He found nothing. The men had worn gloves. There were no plates to chase, no faces to describe. He stood at the gate with his hat in his hand. "You think you know who sent them," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Maren said. "You can prove it." "No." Aldous nodded. He put his hat back on. "I will write it up," he said. "I am not going to tell you not to defend yourself. I will tell you to be careful. Mr. Penhallow has friends in this county. Some of them carry badges." He walked back to his cruiser. He drove away. Nolan watched the taillights disappear. "He told you the truth," Nolan said. "About the badges. There are 2 deputies in this office I would not call if I was bleeding out in a ditch." Maren did not answer. She walked over to where Briggs was sitting in the rain. She knelt. She ran her hands along his sides. He was not hurt. He was breathing hard. She pressed her face into the wet fur of his neck and held him there for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked back to the wall and picked up the framing hammer. There were 8 days left before the hearing. The next morning, she opened the journal again and read the last entry from 1963. She read the line about Eleanor's treatment and Rosalind's shoes. She read the line about the bonds being safe. She read the last words, "Someday I will go back for them." And then, because she had read the front of the journal so many times that she knew the words by heart, she did something she had not done before. She turned the journal over. She opened it from the back. The leather creaked. The pages were stiffer here. The handwriting on them was different, shakier. The ink had pressed harder into the paper. The way an older man writes when his hand is no longer what it was. The first of these back section entries was dated November 4th, 1997. I have not written in this journal in 34 years. Maren held very still. She read on. Calvin had written that Eleanor was gone. She had died on March 9th, 1970 of the same cancer she had been hiding from him for years. He had held her hand at the end. He had promised her he would take care of Rosalind. He had broken that promise. Rosalind had left home when she was 17. She had packed a duffel bag one night and was gone before sunrise. She left a note that said she would call when she was ready. She had never called. Calvin had spent 3 years looking for her. He had hired a private investigator with money he did not have. The investigator had found traces. A waitress job in Indianapolis. An apartment in Columbus. A name on a lease in Dayton. But Rosalind had moved each time the investigator got close the way an animal moves away from the sound of footsteps in the brush. In 1974, Calvin had stopped looking. He had been 63 years old. He had lived alone in a rented room in Springfield, Missouri, working as a maintenance man at a public elementary school. He had lost his wife, his daughter, his town, his career. The only thing he still owned was a piece of land in a place he could not go back to, and a box buried under a tower he had built for people who did not want him anymore. Maren turned the page. The next entries were spaced years apart. Calvin wrote about turning 70, then 75. He wrote about a heart condition, a knee that needed replacing he could not afford, the slow inventory of a body that was wearing out alone. Then she came to an entry dated June 2nd, 2000. The handwriting on this page was different from the others. It was urgent. It was messy. The man who had written it had been writing fast because he could not write slowly. The pen had skipped twice. There was a smudge near the bottom of the page that might have been water and might have been something else. A woman from the state of Ohio called me today, a social worker named Mrs. Kestrel. She said my daughter Rosalind died in a car accident on January 19th of this year. She was 47 years old. Maren stopped breathing. Mrs. Kestrel said Rosalind had a daughter, a little girl named Maren. She is 4 years old. Rosalind had listed me as next of kin on a form she filled out at the hospital when Maren was born. That is how they found me. The first time anyone has found me in 26 years. The page swam. Maren lifted her hand to her face. She wiped her eyes with the back of her glove. She read the next sentence. I asked Mrs. Kestrel if I could take Maren. She said there would be an evaluation. I am 82 years old. I have a heart condition. I live in a one-room apartment. I told her I would do whatever it took. She said she would be in touch. The next entry was dated 2 weeks later. The state denied my petition. They said I am too old, too sick, too unstable to care for a child. They said Maren would be placed in the foster system where she would receive proper care from qualified guardians. I told them I am her grandfather. They said that was not enough. Maren set the journal down on the foundation in front of her. She pressed the palms of her gloves into the concrete on either side of it. She put her head down between her arms. Briggs came over and pushed his nose under her elbow, and she did not push him away. Calvin had tried to find her. Calvin had known about her. Calvin had asked for her, and the state had told him no. She had spent 16 years in the system believing nobody had ever come looking. That she had been passed along because there was nobody at the other end of the chain who had wanted her. And the whole time, an 82-year-old man in a one-room apartment in Springfield, Missouri, had been writing letters and making phone calls and fighting to bring her home. He had failed. She read the rest of the entries by lantern light with the wind moving across the lot and Briggs's head on her thigh. Calvin had not given up after the denial. He had written 6 letters. He had called Mrs. Kestrel every month for a year. He had sent things. A blanket he had knitted. A photograph of Rosalind as a baby. A letter addressed to Maren. He did not know if any of them had been delivered. Most of them probably had not. He had finally stopped calling in 2002. 2 years after that, in September of 2004, he had written one last entry. I am going back to Millbrook. I know the tower is probably gone or falling apart. I know the town does not remember me, but the box is still there. I sealed it to last 100 years. Inside that box is everything I have left to give. I have written a letter. I'm going to put it in the box with the bonds and the photographs. Whoever finds it, whether it is Maren or someone else who carries the Holloway name, will know what happened. They will know I tried. I am leaving tomorrow morning. It is a 9-hour drive. My heart is not good, but I have my medication. I just need to open the foundation, add the letter, and seal it again. If I can do that, then at least something of me survives in the place where I did my best work. I built that tower to give water to a town that needed it. I'm going back to make sure it still gives something to whoever comes next. That was the last thing Calvin Holloway ever wrote in his journal. Maren sat in the lantern light with the rain stopped and the wind soft, and Briggs's slow breathing in her lap. She did not move for a long time. Then she did the thing she had been saving. She reached into the oilcloth bundle. She pulled out the sealed envelope. She turned it in her hand. The handwriting on the front was the same shaky hand from the last entry. The paper had yellowed at the edges. The wax that sealed the back had been pressed with the flat side of a thumb. She broke the seal. She unfolded 2 pages. To whoever carries the Holloway name forward. If you are reading this, you found your way here. You found the tower, or what was left of it. You found the chamber I built into the foundation when I was 37 years old, and still believed I could outsmart the men who wanted to take what I had built. My name is Calvin Holloway. I was the water commissioner of Millbrook from 1955 to 1961. I built this tower with my own hands and a crew of 4 men. I poured every part of this foundation. I welded every beam. I tested every valve. It was the best thing I ever did for this town. The second best thing I ever did was raise my daughter Rosalind in it. I lost both. The tower was taken from me by men who were better at lying than I was at telling the truth. Rosalind was taken from me by my own stubbornness and by bad luck and by the long shadow of the decisions I made when I was younger than you are now. I do not know who you are. Maybe you are Maren, my granddaughter. Mrs. Kestrel told me about you. You were 4 years old when I found out you existed. The state said I was too old to care for you. They may have been right, but I want you to know I tried. I drove to the courthouse in Jefferson City twice. I wrote 6 letters to the foster care board. I called every week for a year. They never let me see you. If you are not Maren, that is all right too. Whoever you are, you found this place. You cared enough to look. That is enough. The bonds are yours. The land is yours. The photographs and the journal are yours. I built this tower to give water to a town that needed it. I built this chamber to give a future to whoever came next. If you are reading this, you found your way home. Build something. Stay. Don't let them take it twice. Calvin Holloway, September 2004. Maren folded the letter. She held it against her chest. She sat in the dark of the frame wall on the foundation her grandfather had poured with his own hands 55 years before she was born. With Briggs across her boots, and Nolan asleep on a cot 10 feet away with the Remington beside him. and the prairie wind moved against the tarp roof, and she did not cry. There was no crying for this. This was something larger than crying. She had a grandfather. He had tried to find her. He had failed. He had driven back to this town in the fall of 2004 to bury one last letter in the foundation of the thing he had built. And somewhere on the road between Springfield and Millbrook, his heart had given out, and nobody had ever told her any of it. And the men who had driven him out of this town in 1961 were the same men whose grandson had run her off the road 3 days ago. She put the letter back in the oilcloth. She wrapped the bundle. She put it under the folded clothes she used as a pillow. She lay down beside Briggs. She did not sleep. She watched the lantern hiss low and finally go out, and she watched the lid of the eastern sky go pale gray with the coming dawn. And she watched the first thin light slide across the foundation her grandfather had built, and she made a promise to him that she did not say out loud. 8 days. 8 days until the hearing. 8 days until she stood up in a room full of men in suits and put a folded confession on a podium and finished the work her grandfather had started in the spring of 1955. She closed her eyes. She slept for 1 hour as the sun came up over the Nebraska prairie, and Briggs lay across her boots and watched the gate, and somewhere in the distance a black Cadillac SUV waited in a driveway in Omaha for a phone call that would not come because the next time Garrett Penhallow saw Maren Holloway, she was not going to be standing in the parking lot of a bank. She was going to be standing at a podium in a courthouse with a piece of yellowed paper in her hand, looking him in the eye.